Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Here's truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, no exception. Rather, we're very excited to be talking to a guy named Pat DeCeasar. Who is Pat DeCeasar? Well, his name is synonymous with rock and roll and entertainment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but frankly all across the country. The words produced by DeCeasar Engler were heard thousands of times on radio and TV. Lots of his events in Pittsburgh became traditions, and such as the Dapper Dan Roundball Classic Celebration of Lights. He has produced concerts in Pittsburgh, including the Beatles in 1964, numerous other bands, including The Doors, Janis Joplin, Led Zeppelin, et cetera, et cetera. Very excited to have him here. Pat, how are you, my friend? Hardest working guy in show business, is that right?
Yes, they say. Loved it, though. Never worked a day in my life, you know.
What did you, everybody wanted to be in the concert business probably back, well, maybe not in the early 60s. It might have seemed a little bit, there weren't that many concerts, so to speak. But tell us how you got into this business in the early 60s.
Well, I started out when I was 18 as a songwriter. I wrote rock and roll music for a group in Pittsburgh called the Dale Vikings, and they had some big hits with "Come Go With Me" and "Whispering Bells," and so I from that I was able to get into the record business, and I became the best floor sweeper and shelf stocker in that business until one day the owner of the company made me a promotion man, and what that meant was I drove around the radio stations all over the country, trying to make hits out of the records that we produced, you know.
You took a bunch of music directors and program directors out for dinner and entertained them and said, come on, man, this is a hit. This is a hit.
Exactly. Begged them to play our records because, we produce a lot of records every week and maybe one or two of them become hits.
Who were some of the bands?
Our guys, they go in the studio, they record everything and then they want promotion guys to make them, become hits.
So you had to make some lemonade sometimes out of lemons. Who were some of the bands maybe you felt like you helped break?
Well, back then, Buddy Holly was one of our acts that turned out big. Jackie Wilson was one also, but there were hundreds of guys that had one hit wonders, and you couldn't build on that. But there were a lot of guys like me with different record companies. Every record company had a promotion man, or every 10 or 15 record companies had one promotion man. So one day I was out in the field and one of my friendly competitors played me a song and he said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And I said, "Wow, that's really a great record. How you doing with it?" He said, "Well, it came out in February and here it was like November." He said, "I can't get anybody to play it." And it was "Love Me Do" by the Beatles.
Oh, gosh.
I said, "Wow, that's really great." It was 1963. So he said, "I got a couple more." He said, "Listen to this." And then he played "She Loves You" for me, which was on Swan Records.
Yeah.
And I said, "Wow, that's the greatest record I ever heard, And he said, "I can't get it played. No one wants to play it." I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Well, they're from England." And that was a problem back then in the early 60s. Americans thought British rock and roll was really corny. And no Americans wanted to hear Britain. No one took England serious for music. And quite frankly, it was that way in Los Angeles, too. I mean, most records were made in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Memphis. It was the East Coast that produced the majority of the hit records.
And the irony of all that was the Beatles and Stones grew up on American rhythm and blues and loved it.
Yeah, that's the other thing. The BBC wouldn't play that music, and they had to listen at nights to Radio Luxembourg to get their American music, or guys who were in the Navy or something, were in a British Navy, maybe visiting New York or on duty there and coming back home, they'd bring hundreds of records with them, and they would just sell them for a big profit because the British people weren't weren't stocking that, doing that, American music. But they loved it. You're right.
And so you're traveling around and you're peddling records like crazy, and you're working with radio stations, and then suddenly you start to, concerts are starting to, I assume, build more and more and more and more and more big American acts, and a lot of what we now refer to as classic rock acts start to emerge. Tell us, how'd you flow from the sort of the music and radio business into concert business? Seems like a logical extension, but back then, concert production had to be thought of as really risky, I would think.
You were so right. First of all, the concerts were played in theaters, and perhaps the biggest theater might be 3,000 seats. Now, at this same time, in Pittsburgh, they built an arena. It had 12,500 seats, which everyone thought, well, that's too big to do a concert. You could do ice capades or basketball games or wrestling, sporting events there, but you couldn't do music. You would never go to a concert in an arena. You would only go to a theater. So when I heard all these records by the Beatles, I come back to the guy I worked for, and he managed Lou Christie. Now, at the time, Lou Christie had some big records like The Gypsy Cried, Two Faces Have I, Lightning Strikes, and he was a national act. And he was booked by the William Morris Agency in New York, the biggest theatrical agency there is in America at the time. There was. But anyway, so I asked the guy I worked for if he would call that agent and ask them about this act. I told him I want to bring this group into the Civic Arena. And when he called the agent for me, he said, "What's the name of the group?" I said, "The Beatles." He said, "I never heard of them." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What hits do they have?" I said, "Well, they really don't have any hits, but I think by the time I could get them to come here, I could make those records hits." So he thought I was crazy, and he called the agent, and the agent said, "The Beatles, I never heard of them. Where are they from?" He said, "England." She said, "Forget it. No British act will ever be big in the United States." And she wouldn't call. She wouldn't try to find out anything about them. And so I insisted that she would call her London office, the William Morris Agency in London, and they confirmed the act was big. And in London, but even the Beatles said, "We'll never come to the United States."
Yeah.
What were you saying? So we'll never come to the United States unless we're number one. We can prove we're number one. So on December 27th, 1963, the Beatles released an LP called Meet the Beatles, and the first song on the first side was "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And the only way you could buy that song is you had to buy the LP, which was unprecedented in this country, in as much as majority of records sold were still single 45s. But when that LP was released, Capitol Records sold 850,000 copies in 10 days, and that was unprecedented. Like I told you, I worked for Buddy Holly. If we sold 50,000 copies of an LP with Buddy Holly, that was big. And here's a guy that had many number one hits in America. Here's the Beatles. Their first release is an LP. They sell 850,000 copies. Absolutely amazing. So I called the agent back, and the agent said, she called the Beatles. The Beatles said, "We're still not convinced we're number one in America." So about this same time, Ed Sullivan was in London, and he was on his way to the airport, and he saw this massive amount of teenagers. And he said to the limo driver, "What's going on?" And the limo driver said, "That's this group called the Beatles. Every time they come in or out of this airport, thousands of these girls come down here and want to look at them." And Ed Sullivan said, "Well, take me over there. I want to see what's going on." And he meets Brian Epstein, and for $1,200, he made a deal with Brian to have the Beatles on his Ed Sullivan show 3 times. And on February 9th, the Beatles, in 1964, they appeared on the Ed Sullivan show, and 72 million viewers tuned in. And that was the largest crowd ever for him.
Yep.
And the next day, it was Beatlemania set in. So I called the agent back, and the agent said, well, yeah, they think they're number one now. You're right, but they're not going to play for you. And I said, what do you mean? That's, well, you're this inexperienced kid. We don't know if you have the money. We don't know if you have the wherewithal, if you ever did a concert before or anything. Everybody in the world wants the Beatles to play for them. We're getting all these offers to play every city in the United States. Why should we play for you? And that's because I would like you to go back and tell them I'm the guy in November that called when no one knew who they were. And she said, well, okay, we'll call for you. So then the Beatles said, okay, we'll consider you under here's two parameters here that you got to consider. Number one, at this time, headlining artists in the United States got $3,500 a night. So if you were a top performer in the United States, you were headlining a concert, your salary was $3,500. The Beatles wanted $35,000. They wanted 10 times more money than any United States performer at that time. And in addition, she said, you got to get $5,000 cash, put it in a brown paper bag, and deliver it to a bartender at the Club Elegant in Brooklyn, and you got 48 hours to do it. If you could do that, then they'll consider you being the promoter. Yeah. So the problem with that, I didn't think it was that bad. I didn't know enough to think it was that bad,
Right.
But I didn't have $5,000. And so I thought the guy I worked for at the record company, he did promote some shows in Pittsburgh as a concert promoter. He owned a nightclub. He managed Lou Christie. He owned the record company. I figured he has $5,000, and to this day, I don't know what the case was, but he said, I don't have $5,000. If you want me to be your partner, I'll be your partner, but you got to go out and get the $5,000 cash. So I set out the next 2 days to try to raise the $5,000. I sold a lot of records to jukebox operators. At the time, there were like 500,000 jukeboxes on location in the country. So if you wanted to sell 1 million records, you could sell 500,000 to the jukebox operators. So I knew a lot of these guys all over the country. And these guys also had, like, illegal slot machines and poker machines, and they had all these games like bowling machines, cigarette machines. I visited some of these guys' houses, and, I mean, I'd go, they'd show me their closet. It'd be full of quarters, dimes, and nickels, And I had unreported income, and I thought, wow, they'll definitely go for this, but not one of them would let me or give me $5,000 or be a partner. Everybody thought I was crazy. I spent 2 days trying to raise the money. I couldn't. And I lived home with my parents. I was just a kid. And my mother and dad I came from a very poor family. My mother and dad had 10 kids. We lived in a 2-bedroom house. My 5 brothers and I lived in the attic. We didn't have any heat or hot water in the house. My dad never made $100 a week in all of my life, but I had told them the story, and they didn't say anything. I went back to work the next day. I come home the second day. I had 6 hours left of my 48 hours, and when we were done eating at the kitchen table, my father slid an envelope over to me, and I opened it, and I took out a check, and it was a check made out to me for $5,000. And I said, Dad, where'd you get $5,000? I know this is a lot of money. And he says, I borrowed it at the credit union where I work. He said, I put the house up as security for a loan. Now, his house wasn't worth $5,000. I said, Dad, I can't take your $5,000. I got to give this to a bartender in Brooklyn. And he said to me, do you believe in the Beatles? I said, yes. And he said, well, then you go ahead and do the Beatles. The greatest gift my father gave me was not the $5,000. It was the fact that he believed in me. And he proved that over and over. But, I mean, I still feel guilty about taking his money even to today, but I did do it and called the agent, and she said, well, you could telegraph it if you want. So we did that to some attorney in New York. And to make the long story short, we got the date, September 14th. It sold out. The first thing I did was give my dad back his $5,000. But the date played, and we made a profit of $8,800. And there were like 12,500 screaming girls there. You couldn't hear anything.
Hey, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. You're listening to Lewis at Large. Got a good one going here. We're talking to Pat DeCeasar. He is known as, all kinds of things, but he is certainly known as Pittsburgh's premier concert promoter for many, many decades. We've been talking about producing a Beatles show back in the early 60s. Interesting story indeed. Pat, again, you've done a lot of other things. The Beatles concert, I know, kind of really got you going in a very real way, but share with our listeners, if you would, a couple of quick stories about some of the artists that you produced. I mean, concerts you produced anyway. Some artists that you really enjoyed working with, and maybe some that were a little bit too temperamental for what you felt like dealing with. Be interested to hear those.
Well, the Beatles was 1964. And besides the crowd being, loud, the girls screaming, they were basically controllable. But what happened after that? In the 60s, we had the cultural change, the revolution happening in many ways. I mean, the Vietnam War was a big deal. We had the introduction of drugs. I mean, prior to this, I didn't have that at a concert, but now people started smoking marijuana, passing it around. In those days, it was illegal to smoke inside a theater, if you can believe that. But then there was women's liberation and in the late 60s. And one of the acts I booked in the late 60s was Janis Joplin. And Janis was with a group called Big Brother and the Holding Company, and she was just breaking her record was Breaking Big Piece of My Heart was the song. And so she broke off from Big Brother and the Holding Company, went out on her own, and we sold the arena out, the same place as the Beatles. But, here I have this female, in the writer requirements, she asked for a case of Southern Comfort. She liked to drink whiskey. So my runner that worked for me, he had a case. He bought the case, and he gave her just 1/5 of it in the dressing room. And she had consumed that well before showtime, and she was kind of upset. And I was in the box office. I would always stay in the box office because I had hundreds of people to pay.
Right.
And I had people to work for me. I just said, hey, get her on the stage at 8:00. Let's get this show over with. And that's the way it was all the time. Just try to get the show over with.
Yeah.
But so he come back to the box office, and he's banging on the box office door, and box office manager's upset. What do you want? He's like, I got to speak to Pat. Okay, let him in. He came in. He said, hey, you got to come back to the dressing room. I said, why? What's going on? Get her on the stage. He says, she's fornicating in the dressing room. Okay. I says, how do you know she's fornicating? The door's open and everybody's watching.
Oh, jeez.
I says, well, you go back there and tell her to quit it and get the heck on the stage. He says, well, she also wants the Southern Comfort. I says, well, didn't you give it to her? You got a case. He says, well, I gave her a bottle. And I said, well, what does she want? He says, well, she's done with it. She wants the rest of the case. I said, okay. So he had locked it in the trunk of my car. I go backstage and get it and bring it to her. He brought it to her, and I said, Janis, you got to get on the stage. And that's always a problem, is getting these acts on the stage, because you're dealing with alcohol and drugs. I mean, they don't care where they are, what they are, what's going on, who's out there. When they're high, and you're trying to deal with somebody that's on drugs or alcohol, it's really difficult to get them to understand, So anyway, I grabbed her by the arm. I said, Janis, come on with me. We're going up stage. And I looked at her. She had a dress on. It was like a fishnet see-through dress. And as I said, it was a day of women's lib, and she had absolutely no underwear on under this dress. And so I walked her up to the backstage, up the steps, onto the stage, and she's wobbling. I'm thinking, man, she's never going to get up there. And I walk her to the mic, and when that spotlight hit her, it was like she was wearing absolutely nothing. And the audience just loved it. And the first words that came out of her mouth were the F words. And at this time, I had never heard anybody use the F word on the stage. Now, here it is, a female. And when she let out with those F words, all that audience just come rushing forward to the stage. And we had a barrier in front of the stage. They just pushed right through that barrier. And I just thought we were going to kill like 10 kids. I mean, they got crushed up against the barrier. So the police immediately stopped the show. And this is the problem. You always had to turn on the lights and to stop the show. And I had to go back up the stage, try to talk to her, talk to the act, to go talk to her, to talk to the crowd, to move back so that, we didn't hurt anybody and get the show going on again. But
you might have gotten lucky with that one. Wow. Pat, what was it like? What about a couple other bands? What was it like to work with the Rolling Stones and also with Led Zeppelin? How were they as acts and their management? Were they easy to work with or tough?
Well, the Led Zeppelin had the toughest manager there was with Peter Grant. He was a big guy, boisterous, hated everybody, promoters, and he always thought you were taking advantage of the act, and that wasn't the case. You had to build a good relationship with the act if you want to stay in business. So, but in their rider, I told you Janice wanted a case of Southern Comfort, which she would drink. They wanted 2 cases of Dom Perignon champagne. Now, I'm not a liquor guy, so I didn't have any idea what Dom Perignon champagne was. But it turns out it's the most expensive champagne in the world. But back in 71 or so, nobody knew what that was in Pittsburgh. So I'd sent my runner to the liquor store generally on the day of the show, because I didn't want to buy cases of whiskey and have them laying around in my office and someone else would consume the stuff. But he goes out the day of the show, and the liquor store says, hey, I never heard of that champagne. I don't have it. And go into another liquor store, the same thing. So I knew this Horns department store had a liquor department, the premier place. And when he went there, they said to him, look, we have 3 bottles of Dom Perignon. It's $100 a bottle, which was a heck of a lot of money, in 1970, 71. And I said to my guy, well, you got to buy 24 bottles of it. It doesn't matter how much it costs. And he said, well, the guy only has 3. He said, you will not find 24 bottles of Dom in all of Pittsburgh, because you got to order this stuff in advance. I said, well, then get the second best. How much does that cost? It was like $80 a bottle. I said, okay, just buy the second best. We'll tell them. So we get 2 cases of the champagne, put it in the dressing room. I'm in the box office. I get a call that the road manager of the Zeppelin wants to meet me. So I went back, and it's never a good sign when you get a call from the act backstage. So I went back there, and in his British accent, I won't tell you the words he used, but he held the bottle up and said, what's this? I said, champagne. He took that bottle of champagne and he whacked it against the wall. Now, the dressing rooms in the arena were the hockey team's locker room.
Right.
So all these walls were concrete block walls, concrete floor and ceiling. I mean, when he smashed the thing against the wall, it just exploded. And then he picked up the next bottle and said, what's this? I said, champagne. Whack. He did that with all 24 bottles of champagne. I mean, I had spent a couple $1,000s for the champagne. Because it wasn't Dom, he just broke them all. He made absolutely no sense. So after the concert was over, I was backstage, and one of the roadies came up to me, and he said, hey, I heard about the champagne. I said, yeah, what was that all about? He said, I forgot the roadie's name. He said, he's going back, when he goes back to England, he has a wedding. His kids get married. And what he does, he's telling every promoter on the road, he wants these unique demands so that he has everything he wants for the wedding, whatever he can take back to England. So he wanted to dump champagne. So he'll probably get it in some cities.
Yep, I love it.
Like I said, it's hard when they're on drugs or alcohol. You can't deal. They're not human, you know.
Well, listen, Pat, as we start to wind down here real quickly, I do want to talk just very briefly, if you would, share with us a little bit about the autobiography, Hard Days, Hard Nights. Tell us about that and how some of our listeners might be able to get a copy of that thing.
Well, the easiest way is Hard Days, Hard Nights on Amazon. You're right. The book turned out to be a bestseller for me on Amazon. And what I do is I tell these same stories that I'm talking about now, just how he got started in the business and what it was like being a promoter at different shows. So it's, I enjoyed writing it. I do a lot of public speaking about it, and I get a lot of great reviews. The book does anyway. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
What about
Hard Days, Hard Nights?
Yeah, well, I know we could talk for hours. I could sit at your feet and listen to this all day long, but we're running out of time here. I'm curious as to do you remember just real quickly, what was the last concert you produced, and what have you been doing since?
Well, last concert, I do what I call Relive the Beatles 64. I wrote a musical based on the story. Basically, I'm telling you about how I brought the Beatles to Pittsburgh. I wrote about the Beatles and the artists who influenced them, like Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis. Like you said, they listen to American rock and roll, and those are the groups who, like when John Lennon first heard Elvis Presley, he decided, hey, I want to sing and play a guitar. So the show is about that kind of life. And I still do concerts. I sold the company to Live Nation, and I was not permitted to do a lot of that to be competition. But
sure.
I still produce certain shows.
Well, we appreciate your insights. Would love to have you back on again. There's a there's so many stories to tell, and whether it's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Kansas City, or Los Angeles, I really appreciate you being on with us today, and have a great holiday season, and we'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Thanks, Winter. Look forward to it. Thank you now.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.